In February 1942, the Japanese Imperial Army throw the British out of Malaya and Singapore and begin an occupation that will last nearly 4 years.
Kita berharap sangat kedatangan Jepun ni datangkan satu rahmat kepada kita. Sebaliknya, kita berada dalam satu suasana yang boleh dianggapkan neraka dunia.
Japanese rule begins with mass murder.
日本的时候，那个是很野蛮的，真的没有人道。
But the Japanese promise that they are reclaiming Asia for Asians.
The Japanese has got one thing in mind. They have got sation, they have got spirit. They want to embed it into us.
Instead, thousands are enslaved, tortured, and starved.
Teruk kerja semua buat. Bukan kuli, habdi.
For the first time, ordinary Malaysians tell the story of how the Japanese occupation changed their lives and Malaya forever. December 1941. A Japanese invasion fleet steams across the South China Sea. The target, Malaya, one of the richest jewels in the British imperial crown. The Japanese plan to seize Malaya's rich resources to build a new empire that they call the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. Just after midnight on the 8th of December, Japanese soldiers battle through 6-foot-high waves to land on Sabak Beach in Kota Baru, northeast Malaya. It's 2 hours before Japanese bombers attack Pearl Harbor and the first big battle of the Second World War in Asia.
Daripada pukul 3 tu hingga sampai ke pukul 8 tu, lepas pala gini tadi, duduk dah kubu. Pasal peluru ni banyak, pop, motor bas ke, saya tak mati dah, tak hidup dah.
The invasion, led by General Tomoyuki Yamashita, takes the British masters of Malaya by surprise, and the Japanese quickly secure Kota Baru. Demoralized British commanders order a retreat, the first of many. To their astonishment, the Japanese deploy overwhelming air power, flying in from bases in Indochina. Waves of Japanese bombers begin pounding cities across Malaya.
We were thinking that it was a RAF display, not knowing that a few minutes later, the Japanese let so many bombs.
First time I heard a bomb, it shook the ground and it frightened the life out of me.
Bodies were scattered about along all the streets of Georgetown.
We had to carry a body for days. I see a lot of people without head, without body, without hands. We were carrying, piling up all the bodies. And sometimes we even burned on the streets there.
To the north, the main Japanese invasion force lands unopposed at Singora and Patani in Thailand. General Yamashita's master plan is to march down through Malaya to capture the British imperial hub of Singapore. As news of the invasion spreads, civil order begins to break down.
There was no more law and order. And then the looting started. People breaking into shops, taking away whatever they could.
As ordinary people panic, the British make a decision that will cost them their reputation. In key cities, they order all Europeans to evacuate, turning a blind eye to the fate of their Asian subjects.
The British already started packing up, and they bolted. They ran away.
For the people of Malaya, the flight of the British is an unforgivable betrayal. It will never be forgotten or forgiven.
They began cursing the British. You're supposed to protect us, and you left us.
The Japanese relentlessly push south, on foot, in tanks and trucks, and most famously on thousands of bicycles. They call it the driving charge. The British have built good, hard-surfaced roads in Malaya, and the Japanese soldiers can move fast, sometimes cycling for 24 hours without stopping. This is no ordinary army. Yamashita's soldiers are battle-hardened by years of brutal war fought against General Chiang Kai-shek's armies in China.
マレーシアに来た日本軍は初めの頃は戦闘部隊、イギリス軍と戦うための体力のある若い独身の兵隊中心の部隊です。大変乱暴な兵士が多かったんです。
The Japanese provoked terror as they marched doggedly down through the peninsula. Thousands of people flee into hiding on nearby rubber estates or into the jungle.
That time, everybody from the city were evacuating, running towards the countryside.
Most in peril, the Chinese.
The Chinese in particular were very afraid of the Japanese because of the stories they heard about the war in China, how the Japanese had massacred the Chinese, raped the women and all this.
To disguise themselves, Chinese girls dress up as boys. They cut off their hair and stop using makeup. Many have their faces darkened. Everyone tries to make themselves as unattractive as possible.
We dare not even venture out, afraid anything might happen. So all of us have to stay indoors. And there was a lady who was pregnant, 7 months pregnant. They raped her until the baby died.
Japanese soldiers plunder anything they can lay their hands on.
Anybody who was well dressed were asked to strip in front of the group of soldiers. They will remove your shirt, they will remove your trousers. They don't care whether you're underwear. Remove means remove. You don't do it, they kick you. And anybody who were watchers were asked to surrender watches to them. Some Japanese soldiers have 4 or 5 watches on their... Oh my God, because in Japan I'm told watches are very, very expensive.
But the Japanese are not in Malaya only to rape, murder and pillage, at least in theory. Japanese propaganda pamphlets proclaim an all-Asia co-prosperity sphere. The big plan is to throw out the hated British and give Asia back to Asians.
Jepun telah pun menanamkan semangat supaya Asia ni dipulang kepada orang Asia dan Jepun nak jadi pemerintah seluruh Asia.
For the KMM, the Young Malay Union, the first Malayan nationalist organization, this idea of Asia for Asians is very seductive. The KMM Vice President Mustafa Hussain hopes that the Japanese invaders may have something to offer their cause of Malayan independence.
KMM members felt that this was the Malay land, so they were clamoring for Merdeka, for independence.
Mustafa Hussain seizes his chance when, at the beginning of 1942, the Japanese march into Kuala Lumpur, Malaya's capital, almost unopposed. He makes a dramatic proposal to the Japanese top brass.
My father was the first man to demand independence for his homeland, for Malaya.
But Hussain finds out all too soon that the Japanese are not in the mood for nation building yet.
This commander, so he said, let Japan be the father, Malays, Indians and Chinese the children. But if the Malay child is hungry, we can give more milk.
In other words, the Japanese will favor Malays, and when the time is right, they imply that they might offer them more. The Japanese juggernaut powers on, with the assistance of a small unit of KMM members. They smash through every defensive line on the road to Singapore. The Japanese attack takes less than 2 months to achieve its aims. And on the 15th of February 1942, British commander Arthur Percival surrenders in Singapore. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill calls it the worst disaster in British history. Soon, all of Southeast Asia will become part of a new Japanese empire, and the people of Malaya will discover the cruel reality of Japanese rule. February 1942. the Japanese set up headquarters in Singapore and Kuala Lumpur. Now they will rule Malaya with an iron hand. The different peoples of Malaya, the Malays, the Indians and the Chinese, will experience the occupation in sharply different ways. Japan has been at war with China since 1937, and the Japanese know that many Chinese in Malaya support Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang forces in their motherland. Just days after the British surrender, General Yamashita orders a mopping-up operation directed against the Malayan Chinese. It is they who become the first targets of the Kempeitai, the ruthless Japanese military police. This mopping-up campaign is called Sukjing, or cleansing by purification. In practice, that means mass murder. In Singapore and all over Malaya, the Kempeitai units order Chinese civilians to report to so-called screening centers. They single out males of military age, aged 15 to 50. For the Japanese occupiers, they appear to be the biggest threat to the new order. Some of the screenings last hours or even days.
The whole town of Kampar, we sat in the Kampar town Padang, not knowing what they were going to do with us.
Disguised local informers often accompany the Japanese units. The Kempeitai give these mysterious individuals power over life and death.
Every exit, there were masked men. And as we made to pass, if we are not wanted, you go straight home. Don't turn back and look around. So many were stopped. They are the ones eventually were all executed.
A priority for the Japanese is destroying a guerrilla force called the MPAJA, the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army. It consists mainly of members of the Malayan Communist Party. Shortly after the Japanese invasion, the British release many communists from their Singapore prisons to fight a common foe, the Japanese.
They were part of the force that fought the Japanese. But after the battle, a number of them managed to get out, and they went back to various states as nominated to start the anti-Japanese army.
As the Japanese tighten their grip on Malaya, the MPAJA units retreat into the jungle. But they depend on local villages, mainly Chinese, for supplies. So the Japanese begin targeting these MPAJA supply lines and the villages that feed them. In the south of Malaya, in the state of Negeri Sembilan, Xiao Bun Ho's family takes refuge near a vegetable farm on the edge of the jungle. One day, a Chinese man comes to the nearby village and orders everyone to register for rice distribution. It is, in fact, a deadly trap.
就他们就来了，就拿个锣打锣敲鼓，你们每个人出来要去街场排队拿那个米粮。我们家里每个人是拿个米袋，家里人每个人手上拿个米袋。
Xiao Bun Ho is 7. He is with his younger brother and sister, his father, and his mother, who is pregnant.
等到下午的时候，4、5点的时候，没有派粮食。后来看到有施粮的军车就来了，他就叫我们去排队跟他们进138里面去。他们就分开，我们不晓得了，他说分一批一批的。他是4个日本兵站在我前面，后来有个年轻人就怕。 他起脚就跑，有一个日本人就追到那个年轻的时候，就当场刺。每个人就看到他刺，就每个人民都怕起来，就每个人喊救命啊，不要杀我们啊！他不管，他3个日本兵刀起来撞上去。我妈妈看在我旁边，我妈妈看到不对劲。 然后抱着我，就躺下去，躺下我就看不见了。那我满身真的，我的旁边都有刺到刀，那是我的完全不知人事。
Later that evening, an old man arrives at the murder site, searching for his relatives.
看到我还在我妈妈压着，他就拉我出来。我妈死的眼睛很大，他就拉妈妈起身，我们跑了，起身。那个老人家就说：“妈妈死了，要跑了。”我的父亲睡在旁边，我的弟弟在想，最小的弟弟给他操啊，死在前面，全家人晚上全部都没有了。
In this one village, the Japanese murder some 650 people in cold blood. Just 50 kilometers away, in another village, 6-year-old Chung Loi loses most of his family on a day he can never forget.
是这样啊，就是分批啊，一班人带出去，就叫你们蹲下来了。我母亲就在我左边这边抱住我的弟弟最小的那个。
Chung Loi's youngest brother is less than a year old.
他抓着我的弟弟跑在伤口的后尾，那个气是那个我的弟弟的肚子那边跌下来，那肠全部流出来啊，但是还没有死呢，就是还是一直哭，就是前面后面背后沉过来，这边走出来，后来给他拉那个刀，那个在压住背上嘛，他压住了把那个刀嘛，那整个人倒下去了哦，就是这边还中一刀，这边又中一刀，中到2刀，那个手那时是不知道晕了了，那是他。
Incredibly, Chung Loi and his 4-year-old brother survive. But this wave of savage executions which begin in the south rapidly engulfs most of Malaya. Massacres take place in many different places, most of them unrecorded. In the 1990s, a few of the Japanese veterans who had served in Malaya spoke openly about what made them kill innocent civilians.
クアランプールから自動車で走っておよそ10分間走ったところのゴム林の中へ連れて行った指揮官がそれが400人ぐらいの中国の人を前にして僕ら兵隊が60人ぐらいそれで言うのや今からこの中国の人を殺す。
According to Miyake, if the godlike Japanese emperor ordered you to perform a task, however terrible, there was no choice but to obey.
我々は何も敵意がないのや殺意が起きない僕たちも人間だからなただいまより大元帥陛下の命によりこれを殺すそして2人ほど将校が軍刀で首を落としたそれを僕はよく見た首が落としたら血柱がな2メートル3メートルぐらい吹き上がる400人ばかりの人を穴の中に埋めたけれどもおそらく半分ぐらいはまだ死んでいない人がいたと僕は思う。懸命にされた。
Even today, the precise number of victims of the Sukching in Singapore and Malaya is not known. Sources suggest the death toll may be as high as 100,000 men, women, and children. In Singapore alone, the Japanese killed at least 25,000 innocent people.
我那么一直不了解日本为什么这样。我们一家人不是战场跟你抵抗的，我们是无辜了，我们死都不知道我为什么会死。 日本的时候那个是很野蛮的，真的没有人道。
In 1942, after a few months, the killing frenzy begins to subside. Now, the Japanese turn their attention to remolding Malaya as part of the Japanese Empire. The Japanese occupation of Malaya begins with mass murder. As this killing spree slowly comes to an end, the Japanese impose the severest discipline on all Malaya. Anyone defying the new administration, or looting or stealing, pays the highest price.
They had 1 or 2 chaps caught stealing, chop off the head, put on a plate, put on table in the Kampa market. This is what you get if you steal.
If you betray the Japanese administration, and then the result would be kapara potong. They say kapara potong. Everybody is afraid of that word kapara potong. Means we will behead you if you try to betray the Japanese. Kapara potong no!
Everywhere, the Japanese set up prominent sentry posts, a visible declaration that they are the new masters. Since even the humblest Japanese guard represents the semi-divine emperor in Tokyo, so it is compulsory to make the lowest of bows as they pass the new posts. This soon turns into a humiliating ritual.
I didn't know that I had to bow because there was no one who told us this. And when I passed by, the guy shouted, "Hurrah!" And I turned back and I saw this fella with his gun in hand, but you know, as a sentry. And when I went to him, he just slapped me. He didn't tell me what mistake I've done, and he demonstrated that I should bow. So I knew that was a mistake, and I bowed.
Malaya will be remolded down to the smallest detail, and that includes time itself. The Japanese calendar is adopted, and overnight, 1942 becomes 2602. All clocks and watches are set to Tokyo time, a powerful symbol of subjugation. With its time and calendars reset, Malaya becomes Malai, a province in the vast Japanese empire. Under Japanese rule, education will become a way of reshaping hearts and minds. By May 1942, most schools have reopened, but the Japanese expunge any trace of the old colonial curriculum.
The Japanese has got one thing in mind. They have got seishin, they have got spirit. They want to embed it into us. They don't want us to be lazy. You have to be punctual. You have got to be strong. They call it seishin.
In the new Nippon Go schools, pupils must follow an exacting routine from early morning.
We had to all assemble at the field, and first we had to sing the national anthem, the Kimigayo, and then raise the Japanese flag. And after that, we went through the physical exercise for moving our hands and legs and all that, you know, getting the blood circulating around.
You have got to do this radio taiso. That is drill by radio. The drill is very simple. What do you call the free hand exercise? You stretch your arm, you stretch your leg, you bend down and up. That's all the Japanese would ask us to do.
On special occasions, all children must praise the Japanese emperor, declaring the equivalent of "Long live the king."
Tenno hika, banzai, banzai.
The Japanese language, which is considered sacred, becomes a vital tool of indoctrination. By learning it, every schoolchild will acquire the Japanese spirit, founded on discipline and loyalty to the emperor.
We were young at that time, 12 years old. It's easy to pick up the Japanese language and the characters, and you have got to sing all the patriotic Japanese songs. Miyoto kai no sora akete, kyokujitsu takaku kogayakeba, tenchi no seigi hatsuratsu to, kibou wa odoru oyashima.
For some children, attendance at the Nippon Go schools is not just motivated by a love of learning.
We went not because we love Japanese language, Nippon Go. We went there because every student was given 2 cigarette tins of rice, and we are given a packet of sugar. We are given that privilege.
In the new Malay, you must grow up fast. Zainul Aziz attends school for just 8 months. Then, at the tender age of 13, he must look for a job.
We had to work. Even you're 12, 13 years old, you had to work. When I started working, I did not know when the war will end. So you continue working and cooperate with the Japanese. That does not mean that you collaborate with them.
For some, there is no choice. All over occupied Malaya, Japanese soldiers snatch young women and girls from villages to serve their needs. These tragic individuals are called the comfort women. The term comfort woman is a euphemism. These women have become sex slaves.
日本兵は200人ぐらいで中隊ということになるんですが、中隊規模の日本軍が駐屯している場所にはもうほとんど必ず慰安所を作ってたんですね。そうすると各地に散らばっていくときにマレーシアからもマレー半島からも連れていくということで、別に中国系に限る必要はありませんから、それこそ可愛い女性がいると強引に連れて行っちゃうということは各地でやったと思います。
One of them is 25-year-old Rosalind Saw, who in a unique interview recorded in the 1990s reveals for the first time the horrors of her sexual enslavement.
They come the lorry, you know, all closed, that cloth, that green cloth, all closed. They close your eyes first, they push you inside the car. So many girls inside there, you know. To sit down to no place, I have to stand. The car go like that. Then I talk slowly. I say, hey, you all, where you all come from? Shh, shh.
The Japanese take Rosalind to the Tong Lok Hotel in Penang, which has been turned into a comfort station. In other words, a military rape center. She is stripped of her identity and renamed Hanako. In the comfort station, Hanako finds herself working with 15 other sex slaves, Chinese, Malay, and Eurasians.
Everybody got one room, sure, our room. We cannot make friends. We must not talk to each other, cannot. You stay your room, I stay my room.
For 3 years, Rosalind endures daily multiple rape.
Morning, 20 person. Afternoon, 20. At night, 20. One day, 60 men.
Not many of these comfort women recover completely. Few have come forward to share their stories, as Rosalind did. They are not the only Asians enslaved by the Japanese. Soon, thousands will be tricked into working as slave laborers on the notorious Death Railway. As they consolidate their hold on Malaya, the Japanese turn their attention to an even bigger prize, British India, the Raj. The military planners of the Imperial Japanese Army conclude that the best way to reach their target is by using existing rail links in Southeast Asia. But one section of the planned route has not been built. So, to reach the Indian border, a new 415-kilometer rail link must be constructed through rugged jungle terrain in Thailand and Burma, and at breakneck speed. Mohammed Saleh is working in a small shop in Bulu Kasap, Johor, when he is persuaded to take a mysterious job in Thailand.
Naik penghulu ni, tiap-tiap hari pergilah kedai. Nak cari orang ni nak pergi. Pergi siam kata dia. Pergi bandar dia kata. Kata dia makan senang, semua beras banyak. Orang siam-siam ke apa dia kata beras banyak. Ikutlah cakap dia. Saya memang suka lah, semua orang suka. Dari Bulu Kasap 24 orang.
After an arduous 700-kilometer journey by train, Muhammad finds himself on a jungle construction site in Thailand. Here he receives just a few grains of the promised rice. For Muhammad is a slave of the Japanese, and he will be working on the infamous Death Railway.
Kerja lah. Buat jalan kereta api. Itulah kerja, siang malam kerja lah. Yang malam lain malam, siang lain orang, tukar-tukar lah. Orang ramai, ada Cina, ada Melayu, ada campur-campur lah. Orang putih pakai ni, spender. Kalau ada baju, orang putih dia. Teruk. Kerja semua juan. Bukan kuli, hamdi.
Merciless Japanese overseers force these slave workers to toil in appalling conditions, with minimal food and in all weathers, whether drenching rain or searing sun.
Kecapi merah tu, 8 orang pikul. Dia nak dijak tu, tak jejak dia marah. Nanda mewah tu. Dah kena dah ni. Tijak, terajang, tempeling, macam-macam cara dia pun.
Every day, rail workers die like flies in the tormenting conditions. They are buried by the track.
Satu hari 40, 30, 20 satu hari mati. Buat lubang besar macam ni, buang aja. Itu yang moderat orang itu habis mati.
On the 16th of October 1943, the last nail is hammered in and the Burma Railway is officially declared open. More than 13,000 Allied prisoners and 70,000 Asian slave laborers perished during its construction. More than half who worked on the Death Railway from Malaya never returned. A life lost for every railway sleeper laid.
24 orang Bulu Kasap. Yang balik 4 orang ni saya cerita tu.
At the time, in occupied Malaya, no one knows anything about the horrors taking place in the jungles of faraway Burma. The Japanese still claim that they are building a greater Asia for Asians. But for many people in Malaya, this is turning out to be a hollow promise.
Kita berharap sangat kedatangan Jepun ni datangkan satu rahmat kepada kita, terutama sekali dari segi barang-barang yang akan dibeli dengan murah. Tapi sebaliknya apa yang berlaku ialah kita berada dalam satu suasana yang boleh dianggapkan neraka dunia. Saya masih ingat tentang kadang-kadang yang susah nak pakaian, tak ada kain. Kita terpaksa gunakan goni untuk jadikan tutup aurat kita.
Shortages like this forced many to find extreme solutions.
Kalau ada jenazah yang dikapankan dengan kain putih, dan biasa berlaku pada malamnya orang pergi korek mayat, ambil kain putih tu untuk nak guna untuk pakai, biasa berlaku.
When your back is against the wall, and you have no other choice, somehow the human mind finds some answer to this sort of things. So when you're hungry, you find some way to find food at all. See?
每天晚上就去扒人家的木薯扒人家的番薯吃。结果我忍不住，就晚上就人家养的羊，就吃它的羊奶，我再把人做乞丐。 拿个一颗人家吃不完的稀饭拿回来吃。
The situation worsens when in October 1943 the Japanese hand over the 4 northern Malay states to Thailand. It's an expression of gratitude for granting Japanese armies safe passage in 1941. But for the Malays, the loss of these states deepens the resentment towards the Japanese, especially since this is a major rice-growing area.
Waktu dia makan ubi, makan kapur ni, dah padi habis ni.
This food war is hardest for the anti-Japanese guerrilla fighters, the MPA-JA, holed up in their jungle strongholds. Since its formation at the end of 1941, the MPA-JA has fared badly. They lack leadership, training, and food. They depend on Chinese villages for essential supplies. This puts many people at risk, for the notorious Japanese police, the Kempeitai, has built up an extensive network of spies, all happy to betray their neighbors.
That person who is arrested goes into the Kempeitai hands. He might be a healthy young man. Probably you may find him 5 or 6 months later coming out as a walking skeleton, because inside the prison they were given all sorts of tortures to extract information.
One especially notorious torture technique used by the Kempeitai is now called waterboarding. In occupied Malaya, its victims referred to the technique as taking Tokyo wine.
The victims were made to lie on a bench, long bench. Then a rubber hose will push through the mouth. A wet handkerchief or handkerchief will cover the eyes and the nose, turn on the tap, allow water to rush in. And when the stomach is filled up, they put a plank, 2 or 3 soldiers will jump on the stomach till the water is forced out through the nose, any orifice might go on, blood will be coming out. Tokyo wine is the name used to tell people it's water torture.
Yap Tek Min is 16 when the Japanese arrest and torture him and his father for having links with the MPA-JA. 2 months later, Yap escapes into the jungle where he joins a guerrilla brigade. He becomes obsessed with seeking vengeance.
因为我的家受到这个华人的走狗啊，我也给他打得很惨，我家里面也受害很多，是一个报复心啊。
For the teenager, taking revenge is a thrilling rite of passage.
第一次打汉奸的时候，不是怕，很高兴，一开枪看有没有倒在地上，有一开，很高兴，不是怕，很兴奋，打到很高兴，就报复的情是这样。
During the occupation, the Japanese play off the different races of Malaya against each other. They murder and torture many Chinese, but often give the Malays jobs as administrators and policemen. This divide and rule strategy is a blueprint for disaster. A bloody sequence of events unfolds in the village of Sungai Lui in Negeri Sembilan. Land is fertile here, crops easy to grow, and this has drawn both Malays and Chinese to the area. Sungai Lui's rich pickings have also attracted the communist MPA-JA guerrillas who are desperate for food. To protect the village, the Japanese post a Malay guard.
Dia sibuk memasang toha lambang Jepun tu lah, kain putih dengan kain merah tu, dia pasang sini. MPJA ada dalam bekan. Bila dia tengok ya, dia pun tangkap. Dia bawa ke hutan tu, dia tembak mati lah.
The Japanese soon find out that their Malay guard has been murdered and dispatch more than 100 soldiers to punish Sungai Lui. Officers call the villagers together and separate Malays and Chinese. Both fear the worst.
Bangi. Abang tu dia tanya, tak tahu, semua tak tahu. Cina ni lah. Komandan ni kumpulkan orang lelaki, kanak-kanak depan orang lelaki dewasa. Orang perempuan dia masukkan dalam kedai tu, pada tepat 12:30 dia bagi order machine gun. Machine.
After killing the men and children, the Japanese set fire to the shop houses with all the women still inside. The Malays can only watch helplessly.
Orang banyak mati berkelempangan di depan tu. Nasib baik Dia kata dia Melayu, barilah. Dia suruh balik.
It's this kind of atrocity that drives a wedge between the different races. As the Japanese empire crumbles, this divisive strategy will push Malaya to the brink of a civil war. At the beginning of 1944, the British counterinsurgency unit Force 136 ramps up aid to anti-Japanese forces fighting in Malaya. Until now, these had been dominated by Chinese communists. Now, it's time to bring Malays into the war against the occupiers.
Pakcik nak menyelamatkan tanah air, tak ada tanya gaji tak ada. Tak ada bukan sekolah ni, gaji berapa sebulan, baru nak pergi, tak ada. Pakcik nak menyelamatkan tanah Melayu ni, pakcik pergi.
One Nick's decision to join Force 136 terrifies his parents, who still fear the Japanese.
Ayah pakcik kata, kamu jangan pergi, dia kata. Kalau mau pergi masuk gerila, aku kena potong kepala.
Many now turn against the Japanese. But other nationalists, led by Ibrahim Yaqub's KMM, have not given up hope that the occupiers might still further their cause of independence.
By June 1945, the Japanese knew that the tide had turned against them for sure. They were losing, so suddenly the big bosses decided that they should give more attention to Malay nationalism.
Realizing that time is running out, Yaqub calls his followers to a grand assembly in Kuala Lumpur to proclaim Merdeka, independence. The meeting is scheduled for the 17th of August, 1945.
Congress was to be held in the Station Hotel in Kuala Lumpur, and then the declaration would be made there. Ibrahim Yaqub would announce it in Malay. My father would announce it in English.
But on the 6th of August, 1945, comes world-shattering news. The Americans dropped the world's first atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second weapon devastates Nagasaki. On the 15th, Japan surrenders. The atom bomb not only knocks Japan out of the war, it blasts Malayan independence off the political map.
Suddenly, Japan surrendered, and that's why my father cried, because between the surrender and the declaration of independence for Malaya, it was only 48 hours. And he had craved for independence for so long. And it was a very sad time for him.
The war is over, or so it seems. But the British armies have yet to reach Malaya. As a consequence, there is a power vacuum, and the communist MPAJA steps forward to take credit for victory.
The town had 2-3 days of all-out celebration. Chinese flags came out, Soviet flags came out. Japanese flags were torn, burned. You see big banners, welcome the liberators of Malaya. They told the people the country is liberated by them.
It's time to settle scores with anyone, either Malay or Chinese, who threw in their lot with the Japanese. The MPAJA set up people's courts to try alleged traitors and collaborators. In a cruel adaptation of Japanese tactics, they invite local people to betray their neighbors.
Any victims who had suffered will go to the People's Court to make a report, and they will take immediate action.
Teenager J.J. Raj is an eyewitness to the travesty of justice that now unfolds.
I watched their kangaroo courts. A lot of people assemble, and they call out one name, see? So the fellow is brought in. He's already arrested. These are so-called people working for the Japanese, so-called traitors. The prosecutor reads out. There are various offenses this man has committed, he said. That the presiding officer looks at the crowd, say, what do you do? See, somebody in the crowd say, kill him. See, the whole lot says, kill, 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 kill. So he says, kill. So immediately the man is taken away.
The violence escalates and spreads, and some Malays turn on the Chinese, whether they are MPAJA or not. Malaya appears to be on the brink of civil war. But in September, British forces finally reach Malaya and land on the west coast. Order is at last restored. The British set up a temporary military administration, the BMA. But not everyone is convinced that the return of Malaya's old colonial masters is a good thing.
Some people were happy. Some people said that the BMA was bringing misery again.
Over time, memories of the occupation fade. And as Malaya becomes independent Malaysia, people are preoccupied with the future, not the past. But today, many Malaysians choose to pay their respects to the tens of thousands who died during the occupation. At this ceremony, they are joined by Japanese professor Nobuyoshi Takashima, who is also determined that the horrors of the Suk Ching massacres in Malaya are never forgotten.
それぞれの事件の犠牲者数を考えると何百人というケースがあるわけですから、やはり普通に考えたら大虐殺と言ってもおかしくないと思います。
For the last few years, Professor Takashima has been bringing Japanese school teachers to Malaysia to inform them about the war crimes committed by their forebears, which many Japanese still refuse to acknowledge.
私たち日本人が参加させてもらえるということはとても嬉しいことです。こういう行事を地元の方と合同でできるというのはやはり少しずつ社会が変わってきている、国際和解ができているというふうに思いました。
The Japanese divided the people of Malaya and set one community against another. Remembering the occupation is a powerful reminder that peace is preferable to war and harmony preferable to conflict. Understanding that lesson from history ensures that future generations of Malaysians never suffer what their forebears did 70 years ago.